Good evening, everyone. Today's Monday, June 25th, and I'm Melanie Morris, also known as the Lady in the Yellow Jacket. Thanks so much for joining me tonight, and hopefully you caught the show last week. Just riveting. And this week, as I promised from last week, we have part two. This author here, Gautam Narula, met Troy Davis, death row inmate Troy Davis. Gautam was 15-year-old, upper middle class, Indian kid, a little bored at home, wasn't feeling challenged in school, so his mom took him to death row. And between Troy Davis's execution and Gautam's newfound friend in Troy Davis, this book happened. And last week we talked to Kavita, his mom. Thank you so much, Kavita, for coming back in tonight.
My pleasure.
And we're going to finish talking about Troy Davis, her son. And don't forget, you can see him next week, July 7th, at the Boston Public Library, 2 p.m., July 7th, 2 p.m. So we talked about Troy and gave a little history about what happened. Do you think Troy was guilty?
You know, that's a great question, because that was a question put to my son, and he turned to me and said, "Mom, what do you think?" And I said to him that I did not know the Troy Davis of 19 years, 20 years, or who he was. But the Troy Davis I knew now was a man who definitely was worth redemption. And it again brings me to a point that, back to the point that, you know, the death penalty is a very cruel final thing. And, you know, people, if they are innocent, if there was even an iota of a doubt that Troy was innocent, he definitely deserved that second chance to live. And, you know, if you see the Amnesty International's comments, they never said whether they thought Troy was guilty or innocent. All they said was the case had too many holes in it, and so it had to be reopened. And you cannot kill a man when there's so much doubt.
You cannot kill a man when there's so much doubt. Do you think the death penalty should be abolished?
I'm firmly in favor of that. And I think I was so disturbed after what happened with Troy that I actually moved from Georgia. I moved to Boston, where there is no death penalty. And I think that you cannot play God, you know, with people who are incarcerated if there's even an iota of a doubt. And, you know, eyewitness testimony is the worst way of convicting somebody, because every time, you know, people's testimony changes. You and I can see the same accident and we'll have totally different versions, and memories are very short. So his entire case was based on eyewitness testimony of juvenile delinquents. 7 out of the 9 eyewitnesses changed their story. And, you know, there was a case where there was one eyewitness that changed story and the judge ordered a fresh trial. And here was 7 out of 9. At least I have never, in all my research as a journalist, I did not see any case where 7 eyewitnesses changed their testimony and the man was still executed.
So you said the judge ordered a new trial. What happened?
So the judge, this was in another case where, you know, there was one eyewitness who changed testimony. So the judge felt there was enough doubt. And so that case was reopened. But when this final evidentiary hearing was done in June of 2010, after the Supreme Court sent it back, which was again kind of unprecedented, because normally they don't interfere in, you know, the bar is set so high to prove your innocence that most of the time the US Supreme Court doesn't really interfere. But even after all the witnesses, you know, came forward and talked about why they recanted their testimony, the judge, you know, actually said there was doubt, but he thought Troy was guilty, and that was the end of it.
He thought Troy was guilty. There was doubt, but he thought Troy was guilty, so there was the end of it. Now, you mentioned moving to Massachusetts, where there's no death penalty. Are you saying Troy Davis's case is one reason why you moved here?
It was one of the reasons. I actually told my children that I think it's time to move out of Georgia, but you know, I really feel very sad living in a state where, first of all, death penalty is such a barbaric thing. And, you know, and if you notice, most of the death penalty executions are actually carried on. The largest number is in Texas and Georgia. In the southern states, actually, you know, even when people are convicted in other states, many times they're given life sentences. And you know, USA had the dubious distinction 2 years ago of being the top 5 countries, along with, I think, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, North Korea, and China, of carrying on the highest number of executions. And we have the largest number of incarcerated children, you know, in jail in the world. So there is a lot to think about. You know, and yes, I mean, it's not that in Massachusetts there are not difficulties, because I've met many people here too whose children are incarcerated. They've had life sentences. But at least if there is even an iota of a doubt that somebody is innocent, that there's something that doesn't seem right, at least that person has a chance
Right.
to prove their innocence.
Person has a chance to prove their innocence. Now, was Troy Davis given an opportunity to plead guilty and he would be spared the death penalty?
You know, I've heard stories about this even before, but I know that the fourth execution date when he was denied, clemency by the Georgia Patrol Board. And I also want to say that the Georgia Patrol Board comprises not of any lawyers or judges, but these are people from the police department and GBI agents. So if you are a black man convicted of killing a white cop, you are going to be sure that, the sympathies are not going to be with you. I was told by Martina after Troy was denied clemency that he was told that if he says he's sorry and for his crime, he would get, they would commute the sentence to life without parole. And I think there was an understanding that, you've become so famous, there are so many people fighting for you, maybe, something may happen and the case may be reopened, because as long as there's life, there's hope, right? But Troy said that, I didn't commit the crime, and why would I plead guilty to that? And, in fact, my last conversation with him was on Tuesday night. He was executed on Wednesday, on the 20th of, September. He called to check on me and he was laughing. I said, why are you smiling? He said, why are you so sad? He said, look, no matter what happens to me, don't ever give up your faith in God and continue to fight for other Troy Davises that are, languishing in jail who are innocent.
So continue to fight for other Troy Davises who are in jail. Folks, if you're just joining us, I'm Melanie. I'm your host for tonight. And my guest is Kavita. Her son, Gautam Narula, actually wrote this book about the life and death of Troy Davis. Gautam's going to be at the Public Library, Boston Public Library, Copley Square on July 7th. So you can come and meet him. You can get your book on Amazon. Are you going to be selling books there as well?
Yes, he'll be signing books there.
Will you be selling them also?
Selling them also, yes.
Okay, so you can come down to the Boston Public Library on July 7th, buy your book, and get it signed by Gautam Narula. Let's talk about Troy Davis's family. You mentioned his sister, Martina.
Yes.
Now, and tell me about his mom and his sister.
Well, his father actually passed away a few months after Troy was convicted of shock. And his sister Martina was really his lifeline. I mean, I think they were twin souls. She was 18 months older than him, and she was quite a firecracker. And she joined the military when Troy was convicted. She was told that she could not support, anti-death penalty issues because it's a federal thing. So she actually resigned from the army, lived hand to mouth, ran, from pillar to post, to anybody who would hear about her brother claiming his innocence, but people completely ostracized the whole family that was until then very well respected. And nobody heard her, until Amnesty took on the case once they went over it. In the meantime, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. She was only 30 and was given 6 months to live. But she went on, to live and passed away 2 months after Troy was executed. She was a single, woman crusader for this cause. And if it wasn't for Martina, Troy would have been executed long time back. So she actually, was highly recognized, given a lot of recognition even for her fight against breast cancer, her humanitarian work. It was not just her brother that she was trying to save, but there were people who would come to her now that she was a well-known personality, and she was trying to help whoever she could. Even the day Troy was being executed, I remember her sitting on a wheelchair, and somebody actually came to her and started talking about some family member who was incarcerated, and she still took that information. And there is this really beautiful picture. It's very heartbreaking there's a lightning strike when Troy was executed, and just this one single tear in Martina's eyes because she never cried. Neither did Troy, but towards the end she was in really bad shape health-wise. And one of the last conversations I had with Troy in September, maybe around 14th or 15th, was that he said, I'm not, I've never cried in my life, but I'm very worried about Martina. I feel that she won't be able to survive if, I was executed, and I worry about her a lot. That was the day that I cheered him up. Usually it was the other way around because he was always cheering us up every time his execution date was set. His mother was, again, in perfectly good health, died in her sleep in April.
So April before
he was executed. I remember the date, April 12th. I know that we got that message that she had died in her sleep. The doctor said there was nothing wrong with her. I guess her heart couldn't take it. But she was, again, a woman of great faith. And, Troy told me that, the thing is that he's just caught in this time bubble. When he dreams, he used to dream of his parents, when he was 19. And then his mother would come every year and he would see her limping and he would see the wrinkles on her face and he would see, her hair graying. And then reality would strike that, okay, this is how time is passing. But he was, this is really not a tragic story because he mentored so many people behind bars. I read letters from children saying, Troy, because of you, I'm going to law school. Troy, because of you, I've stopped doing drugs. There were adults who came, who he really redeemed. He definitely changed the way I looked at life. Definitely made me much more compassionate, made me a lot less judgmental, because all we see of people are that they're just mugshots. You don't see the lives, the human beings. And that is what my son wrote, like, have they failed us or have we as a society failed them? Because there was a story of this young man who was incarcerated. He was on death row also, and we heard that his mother was an alcoholic. And he was a little boy, and she would leave him out in the rain in a drunken stupor. And he started sleeping with the dog in the kennel, and then he started crawling on all fours, thinking that he was a dog. Eventually, he was treated very brutally by another man who was with his mother, and he shot him. So did he fail or did we fail him? Because he didn't know any better.
I'm sorry, who shot who?
The young man shot the man who was with his drunken mother.
Okay.
He was 19 years old. And he also very gallantly took the rap for his girlfriend who, just did some time in jail and left. But he was still on death row when we met him. So when I looked at him, this was an intelligent young man who was actually very smart. He knew a lot about stuff and we were talking to him. But look at his life, because there was nobody to, pull him out of that poverty and to help him. And this was a white man. It was not even a man of color from a poor background. So like I said, injustice is colorblind. It can happen to anyone.
Injustice is colorblind. It can happen to anyone. And speaking of color, you're of Indian descent. Your son obviously is of Indian descent. And you get connected with, like you said, a poor African-American man who's on death row. What does that do for you? Or how did you get into this? Or, how does that make you feel?
My father has a military background. I also come from a family of bureaucrats and police officers. My father used to go to military court and fight for some of his soldiers. And what I learned from him was that you have to embrace everyone, every culture, and that justice must always be tempered with compassion. And it was an eye-opening for me when a brain surgeon that I met who was, African American, he said to me that I'm one of the highest paid physicians in the country, but my day is not the same as yours because I wear my suit and I step out, a black man, and I know that people are not going to look at me the same way as they look at you. You're from India and you're this model minority. You guys are doing very well. You're very well respected. How do you do it? And I really had no answer for him. And at the time I decided that if I could make a change, it would be to even create a global platform on my website to bring cultures and ethnic groups together to work as a community. Because until we do that, there is always going to be division, there's always going to be fear of the unknown amongst us. And underneath the color of our skin, we are all the same, with the same concerns, the same desires, the same wishes for our children, the same wishes for a healthy, happy life for ourselves.
That wasn't Dr. Ben Carson, was it?
No, it wasn't Dr. Ben Carson.
Okay.
he probably would have fallen asleep while talking to me.
Folks, if you're just joining us, I'm Melanie, I'm your host. My guest tonight is part 2. If you didn't see part 1 last week, you'll be able to catch it on my website, Melanie Morris TV, on my YouTube channel, or on the Somerville Media website. And this book is written by her son. My guest is Kavita. His name is Gautam Narula. It's about the life and death of Troy Davis and capital punishment. It's called Remain Free. You can also go to remainfree.com and read some excerpts from the book. Thank you again for coming back for part 2.
My pleasure.
So let's talk about, obviously, spending 20 years on death row must take a toll on someone. And since you developed this relationship with Troy, you'd visit him, he'd call you, he was like your kid's uncle. What did he talk about? What did he tell you about the toll that death row takes on a human being?
It's fascinating for me to see, not just with Troy Davis, but even when I was looking at Anthony Hinton's interview. His book was Oprah's Book Club Choice.
Right, and
for this month.
Anthony Hinton was the gentleman that was recently released from jail after 30 some odd years.
Yeah.
And Oprah Winfrey selected his book for her book club, book choice of the month. So you can check out his book as well. So you said you were talking about Anthony.
So it was the same question that Oprah asked him, like, how come, and I think Gayle King asked him, like, how come, like, you have no, anger and, hostility towards the people who incarcerated you? It was the same thing with Troy. I never saw him angry. I never saw him, like, vindictive, resentful, And I think what death row teaches you, which it doesn't teach people like us who are imprisoned, as I've always said, in the prisons of our mind, sitting outside, not doing anything much many times. I think it teaches you how to live in the moment and to appreciate every simple good thing that comes your way. Even the fact that you can live another day, because he had 4 execution dates set. He went into jail when he was 20, was on death row when he was 20, and he was finally executed in 2011. He was born in 1968, so he was in his mid-40s. And I saw no bitterness. I just saw he was a man of great faith. And he said he wasn't like that before, but once he got into death row, I mean, faith is all you have and hope is all that you can live for. So there was no bitterness ever. But he said it was also because of his family. He had very strong family ties, and they were there every week. They took care of him, they supported him, they loved him. And it was only like 4 or 5 people. And the others who did not receive that love and compassion became quite hateful and vindictive themselves. And there was a lot happening in death row where people would, get weapons and hurt each other. There was a guard that was attacked. The guards attacked them. So there is that dark side, but he said he mostly kept to himself. He read a lot of books. He kept himself fit so he could defend himself, but he never got into trouble. He said most people don't get into trouble because they don't want to lose their visitation rights, because those are taken away from them if they're written up. So a lot happens on death row, but it's amazing. More than that, a week before you are killed, you're put in solitary confinement. They take away everything from you except you have the phone that you can call and maybe a letter and pad. That's it. So you can call people. It's literally like they try to break your spirit before they kill you.
So since he was on death row 4 times, they actually took all his items away 4 different times.
Yes. It's like Russian roulette, and suddenly, we changed our mind. Fine, you can go back. Can you imagine what it does to a person that you are hours away, minutes away? And in his case, in 2008, the execution was stopped literally 90 minutes. He had just finished recording his last message to his family. And the gurney was prepared and the lethal injection was to be administered. And literally, his lawyers ran, and the Supreme Court was in recess. And they had already set his date to review the case on 29th of September. So why were they in such a hurry to kill him? That's what got my son interested. Like, if he is guilty and the Supreme Court wants to look at the case on 29th September, why did they set the execution date for 23rd September?
Right. So just to clarify that, folks, to make sure you got that, they set his execution date, and then they set a Supreme Court date for them to look at the case after he would have been executed.
Yes. So then
which doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't. And that's when you start thinking, like, what are they afraid of? What are they hiding? If they're so sure that they can prove, why are they against having the case reopened? But I think Troy's death should not be in vain, which is what he said, if the inevitable should happen, let my death not be in vain. Please save other Troy Davises like me. And that's really, what we want to focus on. And we hope that, all the communities can join us. And I think, wherever my son has talked, he's loved talking to high school children, because that's the most formative years of your life. And that's when a lot of peer pressure is there for you to get in with the wrong crowd, because just to be accepted, which is what Troy did. He was a shy kid. His sister was a firebrand. So he started hanging out with some of these kids who were like, suddenly drugs had come into Savannah, Georgia, and he would sometimes pay people just to save their lives because, they were involved in all this business. So there's a one of the guys said to my son, he was one of Troy's friends when the final evidentiary hearing was held. He said, there's one side of Savannah, the touristy side, the beautiful side that all of you see, and then there is this dark place of drugs and dope peddling. And remember, we don't have a choice which side we want to be born on. And so it's very, very important to keep that in mind.
Right. We don't have a side. We don't have a choice of which side we want to be born on.
And that's why it's so important to learn this lesson that you have to protect yourself and not, be misled. And that's where families really come into play.
And I'll get a chance to ask your son this, because, folks, if you're just joining us, I'm Melanie, I'm your host, and we are talking to Kavita. Her son, Gautam Narula, actually wrote this book about the life and death of Troy Davis, Remain Free. You can read some excerpts at remainfree.com. and you can meet him July 7th at the Boston Public Library, 2 p.m. So, and I'll get a chance to ask your son this, but what does he get feedback from the young people, you said, when he talks to high schoolers, or what do the kids say to him? Do they understand?
Well, I think that, like you said, that would be a great question to ask him, because I'm sure that, I haven't attended a lot of his events. Some I have, and some where he went on his own. But I think it definitely moves people. Whenever I've talked about Troy Davis, amongst people, amongst young children, even to my own daughter, because when she was young, she handled Troy's incarceration and his death very differently. She started doing drugs, she got into fights with people. Gautam, on the other hand, channeled that into his academics, into writing this book. And he actually asked her if he should write about what she went through, and she said yes, because I have nothing to hide. She lives life on her own terms, and everybody should know what people can go through, because she didn't move with the right crowd. And she was written up so many times in school, in school suspension, out of school suspension, and then went to college and was on the dean's list, completely turned her life around. And Troy was instrumental in telling her that, I'm dying to live, but there are people who live to die. Don't ever say, she said to him once, Uncle Troy, I'm bored. He said, don't ever say that. And so I think, it's a very impactful story, and it has changed a lot amongst people. I mean, Gautam was himself a very shy, introverted kid. He was this academic scholar and all that. But he never really got into debates and stuff. But then he started the Amnesty chapter, and actually went and distributed flyers and got so actively involved. It really changed him and his friends, because many times his friends' mothers would tell me that, everybody just talks about Troy Davis because of your son. We are getting to know him because of your son. So I'm sure that, when he speaks, it is impactful. It does make a difference. But, the only thing I say is memory is short. We have to have constant reinforcement. You're moved at a particular time, and then life gets in the way.
Right, we're moved and then life gets in the way. I can't wait to meet him. I'm excited to meet him. Now, when I was reading through the book here, I noticed like one of the first letters he sent to the White House.
Yes.
Can you want to talk about that? Or any of the letters that he sent to the White House, trying to save Troy's life.
Yes, and he also kept the typos in the book, because a lot of people said that's bad editing, and he said, no, that's the way I wrote it as a 15-year-old. I think it was a big disappointment. We are all big fans of and big supporters of President Obama. He never really heard from them, and there were so many people before him that went the same route of writing letters to the Pope, writing letters to President Obama. President Obama did speak when Trayvon Martin was killed. Right. He said he could have been my son, but there was not even a word from him about this case. When his mentor, Charles Ogletree, who was a professor at Harvard, actually had a very big event. And one of the reasons why the U.S. Supreme Court actually sent the case back to Georgia to have a judge preside over it to see if there was enough doubt that Troy was innocent was because Charles Ogletree was one of the many lawyers who actually wrote that letter, that petition, that the case be reviewed and reopened. And so there were like 20 or 30 judges who got together, lawmakers who got together and requested this. So yes, he didn't get a reply from President Obama, and I think maybe for a child who was an idealist and who was very optimistic, it was as he grew older and when he started writing his book and Troy was executed, I think he realizes now that he went into deep depression because of the disappointment, and he writes in the book that so everything I did mattered to nothing because of the justice system that is so unjust. And he said in one of the interviews he gave that laws without morals are unacceptable in this society, in a civilized society.
Laws without morals are unacceptable in a civilized society. I'm sure he was disappointed, but it's still that it took great courage I can't believe, he was 15 years old when he actually did this.
He said something really funny in the book. We went to Troy's grave. It's unmarked. It's a poor part of the town. After all the hoopla and the circus was over by some of these organizations that actually really benefited from that publicity. So we went, and we could not have even found the grave until somebody took us there. Mm-hmm. And my son he was looking at all the names of people who had died, some young, some old, and he wrote that there's nothing nothing that makes you feel more stupid than being in a cemetery, because he had something in his eye, he had hurt himself, his test hasn't gone well, and he put everything in perspective. That whatever you have to do now. and you have to focus on the positive, and even though there's discouragement and there's disappointment about what happened to Troy, but Troy was never the kind of person who went into depression. He cherished every moment that he could spend joyfully, positively. And so he said, I am going to be Troy Davis, and I will be free, and I will continue to be positive and continue to make a change and make a difference.
Obviously, this was published after Troy's execution.
Yes.
So did you leave a copy at his grave, or how does Troy know this was published?
So there was something that happened where we had some people who were not happy that this book was being written. And there was some stuff that was said that, my son was trying to cash in on this. And so he was very disappointed. He started getting like chest pains. He didn't want to write the book anymore. And I got to the bottom of it, and the heckling stopped, because I confronted the very people who I knew were, and there were some people known to us. So when there was a talk of a big launch for the book, my son refused. He said, I'm going to put this on Troy's grave to let him know that, this is my launch. And when we went there, it had rained, and I said, I don't want it to fall in the hands of those people. They come here every time, and so he said, Mom, I don't care. I'm going to leave the book here, because this is to tell Troy that it has brought all of us together. This is the book that brought so many people together. Strangers funded this project, and so we are all in it together. I said, well, I hope it goes to the right person then. And suddenly this black man in shabby clothes approached us while my son was writing a letter to Troy on the copy, and he said, what are you doing on Troy Davis's grave? And we said we knew him, and his eyes just lit up. He said, you knew Troy Davis? And how much is the book? And my son said, it's $25. And I saw his face just fall, because he couldn't afford it. He was working in the cemetery office. He had just joined 2 months ago. I just looked at my son, and he looked at me, and he said to the man, let me write this letter to Troy, and I'll be giving you this book. He said, Mom, I think it went to the right person. And he was very joyful about it. And after that, this book has just taken on its own destiny. And we haven't done any publicity. We don't have a big publisher, but we just keep meeting human angels along the way who just keep promoting it and helping us share the story.
Well, I am so happy to have shared this story.
And I'm very thankful to you.
Yes, and we are out of time. We are out of time. Folks, again, July 7th, come to the Boston Public Library, 2 p.m. to meet Gautam Narula and buy the book. You can find it on Amazon. You can go to remainfree.com to read some excerpts. Thank you all. Have a good night and have a great 4th of July.